Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. Today's video is going to be the Double Game Week 29 video, and I wanted to change it up by simply doing a long form video just of me talking and reacting to the Double Game Week 29 and the fixture probabilities as laid out in this screenshot on towards the left of me. So what I think is so interesting here is Ben Krellin has created this wonderful spreadsheet and this image. This computes effectively all the fixture probabilities that we have and our understanding of fixtures in terms of doubles and blank game weeks heading towards game week 34. And the idea, of course, is this second half of the season is where a lot of the engaged FPL managers who look towards planning will actually get a lot more points and rank rise much more than they would have in the early parts of the season. Because what happens usually early on in the season, if you think about even gambling, for example, is our expectations of teams aren't perfect. In fact, it's very far usually away from our expectations. The rise of Arsenal this season and how strong they've been is not something I think we would have expected before the season started, but people who actually early adopted Arsenal into their FPL teams have actually benefited long term. The same thing with, for example, re-embracing Newcastle assets after the World Cup, or even United assets as an example. So this is the kind of landscape of FPL, I think, where you no longer have this sort of break. You don't have too many international breaks as well. And we have a good understanding of teams and the assets so far. And the idea, of course, is to look towards the end of the season and to play around what actually has the most amount of probabilities, which is actually the fixtures. You have these FA Cup impacts that will change whether or not you have a blank on one game week. In terms of, let's say, for example, 28, you have Liverpool versus Fulham, which could be a blank if Fulham beat Leeds in the FA Cup. On the other hand, if Leeds actually beat Fulham in the FA Cup, then you actually have a blank game week between Leeds and Wolves. So you can see, of course, that these impacts and these probabilities aren't really illustrated by how good some teams are, but rather how effectively you're planning around them and what you have set in stone in terms of your transfers towards targeting these big doubles, these blanks. And the big doubles are going to be 29 and 34. These are going to be the largest double game weeks of the season. A lot of people will traditionally try to target these doubles with either a free hit, a wild card, or a bench boost. Now, I understand a lot of you guys don't have all your chips to hand. Some people may have already used their free hit, may have already used their wild card, may have also already used their bench boost. But I will talk about, first of all, the free hit chip. And I'll talk about it in terms of the short term, in terms of 25, what your transfer should be for every sort of free hit possibility that I foresee, at least heading towards 34. And then we'll talk about wildcarding and bench boost. Traditionally, I think a lot of people think about wildcarding and bench boosting together. I also have some discussions that I will make in terms of whether you can freely and naturally bench boost in 29. But most of my discussions around wildcarding will be around game weeks 26 and 7 and also 33. Let's actually start with the free hit in 25. So, of course, this is the initial opportunity that a lot of people foresaw to free hit because they're not interested in Liverpool assets. Now, if you just watch Liverpool versus Real Madrid, which I think is a very, very poor estimation of how good this Liverpool team is, simply because Real Madrid aren't going to be playing Liverpool in the Premier League, is how good this Liverpool defense is. What in reality we've seen with a lot of Premier League opponents is this Liverpool team have simply been shocking on defense. Newcastle 10 versus 11, I actually think that Newcastle created a lot of expected goals. And of course, Saint-Maximin is someone who's probably historically unclinical, but still found it very easy to break apart this Liverpool defense despite having a one-man disadvantage in his own team. Bruno Guimaraes will also be joining this Newcastle team back, so we already know that Newcastle will expectedly look a lot stronger after his return. But if we just switch gears back to Liverpool, I think simply put, their defense hasn't been interesting. But what has been interesting, though, is on the off chance that they actually do manage to keep the clean sheet versus some opponents who are very lackluster, such as what Everton were in the last Merseyside derby, you do have an extremely high ceiling between Trent and Robertson. And I think, simply put, when you look at Crystal Palace and Wolves, both two teams that I would say consistently struggle to score, maybe not versus Liverpool, we'll see, but you have a great opportunity here to target Trent. And therefore, this becomes a great blank game week as well, because you can simply just support Trent with two other Liverpool assets, namely Salah and Darwin. What I don't like about the free hit, of course, is a lot of us are invested into assets like KDB. He is such a simple transfer to Salah this week. It almost covers the full strength of the free hit. So I don't really like 25. I also think that the Everton and Wolves fixtures are terrible, simply because the Everton attackers and the forwards are very uninteresting. You could say that Mateus Cunha from Wolves is interesting. You could say Iwobi is interesting, or maybe McNeil as well from the midfield position, Everton. But I think only between those two teams, given that Wolves have a pretty terrible fixture, 2 games away from home versus 2 very, very good attacking teams, and Liverpool were very unlucky. And I think if you replayed that game where Wolves beat Liverpool 3-0, once again, you'd actually see that Liverpool would probably score in most of those iterations, although they'd probably still lose to Wolves. So that's kind of my opinion there. Two kind of lost clean sheets for Wolves. Whereas with Everton, of course, Aston Villa have been able to score versus Man City and Arsenal, which is an extremely tough task, and it really shows the quality of what Aston Villa have to offer. But I think like you believe in the quality at least of the jammy sort of clean sheet. They did it already versus Arsenal. I'm not saying it's going to happen again, because I think the Emirates is a completely different task. But I think at least you've got a chance there with Tarkowski, for example, to get a clean sheet in that fixture. And the reality with Everton and Wolves is Wolves have some terrible fixtures after this. Maybe they actually get to play in blank game week 28 if Leeds actually successfully, or they will play versus Leeds if Leeds unsuccessfully beat Fulham in the FA Cup, and if Fulham advance, then of course you have Leeds versus Wolves. But I really don't like the fixtures for Wolves going forwards. You've got Tottenham, Newcastle, Chelsea, and Brentford lumped in. They're heading towards 33. As far as Everton, if you think longer term, they're a bit more interesting, right? Because they cover you well in the blank game weeks in 28 and 32. And yes, of course, whilst 28 is a very, very tough fixture versus Chelsea, the reality is you're still getting points, hopefully, from a defender, maybe 1 point or 2 points, but that's the reality because the Chelsea team haven't been super high scoring. If we go back to 25, as I said, I don't think it's a great free hit opportunity. I think you're better covered by short-term transfers this week, such as KDB to Salah, such as Mitchell to Darwin, if you have the opportunity to do so. And even if you have to sacrifice Kane this week, I think it's a good opportunity to do it if you want to captain Salah this week as well. So that's kind of my thoughts on free hit 25. I would completely throw it out of the window. As far as free hit 28, this is the next opportunity where people think about free hitting. Why I don't like this game week is simply because everyone owns all the Arsenal assets, right? You can only have 3 Arsenal assets this week. That's not going to change on a free hit. Arsenal Crystal Palace is the fixture to target here, outside of Aston Villa and Bournemouth. And I think Aston Villa versus Bournemouth is a tough fixture to target. So I think Bournemouth have an opportunity to keep, or at least take away the clean sheet from Aston Villa. That's probably a good game to actually pick an Aston Villa asset if you're free hitting. But what's the ceiling here on some of the defenders? I don't think they've been super attacking as of late. So the ceiling isn't that high. I would say Watkins is also potentially a transfer that you can actually adopt already as a manager gearing towards game week 28, simply because Aston Villa will have a double game week right after that. So if you're actually bringing a free transfer in 28, I would actually encourage you simply going for Watkins on that week, because it's such a simple and easy transfer to make. And then if we're talking about a team like Chelsea, they're the next team that have the sort of highest ceiling fixture here. And the reality is the Chelsea team, specifically under Potter, have been really, really poor. So the blank game week 28 seems to be based around the ceiling of Aston Villa, the ceiling of Chelsea, and then also the ceiling of Newcastle specifically, because one thing, of course, is that Newcastle will be playing Nottingham Forest at home. So Nottingham Forest at home, we know, has been, I wouldn't say a fortress, because Man City were very, very unlucky to score more than 1 goal, but it is Man City, so a completely different picture there. Newcastle will be, of course, rejuvenated by Bruno Guimaraes, but Newcastle have also found it recently, at least, quite hard to actually score. So I would say, what's the ceiling there with Newcastle? Trippier seems like a great shout this week. Maybe, of course, Botman can get a clean sheet as well. But then you might also make the wrong decision between Wilson and Almiron, and that's already sort of thrown out the ceiling of the free hit for you. So this is a very tough fixture, in my opinion. And then, of course, Leeds versus Wolves. I mean, you have some options there between both teams. If, let's say, the scenario where Liverpool unfortunately get a blank game week with Fulham, then that seems to be super, super low ceiling to me. So I would only think about game week 28 if, let's say, Potter was sacked, and if we had something to be inspired about in terms of if this is a fantastic opportunity to capitalize on Newcastle and Nottingham Forest look consistently worse. But I don't really think that's going to be the case, because I think Nottingham Forest have already solidified their team quite a bit, and we've seen it in terms of the fixture results lately. So that's kind of my opinions there on 28. I think it's a very low ceiling week. You might lose out on 10 to 15 points versus the average free hitter this week, but what's the sacrifice? I think the sacrifice is you actually potentially get another better week to free hit in. And what is the other better week to free hit in? It's going to be 29 or 34. 29 is interesting to me. So I think 29 is interesting because first of all, you'll be dropping your Arsenal assets and then you'll be dropping your Man City assets as well. So that means you probably would put Haaland onto the bench. You'd probably be putting all your Arsenal assets onto the bench. Now, Arsenal, in my opinion, have a fantastic game. City don't have a fantastic game from a kind of defensive point of view, but I think Arsenal, you've got so many assets here who can haul. And then with Haaland, I think you'd be very happy to embrace Haaland versus Liverpool. This Liverpool defense have been shocking. They're not going to be able to get any more defensive or midfield reinforcements for the remainder of the season. And so this is a great opportunity to target Liverpool. So I do like Haaland here, and I think he will be a huge miss if you're free hitting. Therefore, 29 is all about free hitting towards assets like the Aston Villa players that I mentioned, such as Watkins, going for and maybe skipping a Brentford asset here because it's a very tough fixture piece for Brentford and United. You could, of course, go for Tony. You could embrace Solanke as well from Bournemouth. I think that could be a very interesting transfer. But realistically, you're going for triple Brighton. You're probably going for triple Chelsea, and you're probably going for triple United. Why is that? First of all, with United, a lot of people will actually take out a lot of their United assets, even on game week 25, such as this week, because they have so many blanks in the future. It actually makes sense to go out of United assets because they just simply don't have fixtures. Whereas with 29, if you're free hitting, it's a great opportunity to reinvest back into Fernandes for that week, reinvest back into Shaw that week, and you'll have a fantastic lineup with Rashford potentially being your captain. You'd be able to sidestep Liverpool in that double game week, which is actually very tough. You could gamble onto this Leicester team, which I think could be interesting. We'll continue to monitor the form of Iheanacho, Barnes, and Maddison, but these are all assets to think about there. And West Ham, I mean, it could be interesting. It really depends on Newcastle and what we perceive of them. But that week could also be interesting because maybe there's a small little chance that Tottenham could also double in this week. So you could also go for Kane in that eventuality. But the reality is, I think you have good enough differential double game week players in this week to actually have a much more higher ceiling than whatever you would lose out in 28. And that's kind of my opinion. I think 29 is a far superior free hit. And then with 34, this really depends on what your chip strategies are, right? Because if, let's say, you're planning to play something like a wild card in 26 and 27, you could, of course, think about going for a very optimal free hit in 34 and just playing the best potential high ceiling double game week. This is my preferred way of playing FPL. I just think that there are more opportunities to gain points in these weeks than to actually, let's say, lose points in these weeks where you have blanks in 28 and 32. And 32 for me follows very, very similar logic to 28, where I think the games just don't have a super high ceiling and they're rather dull, to be quite honest. So I would not think about it. 29 is interesting because, as I said, there's this trade-off here with Haaland, whether you want a free hit in 29. Now, this is all the free hits being covered. I think for me, the most interesting strategy is probably going to be free hitting on 29, if I'm being completely honest, and then wildcarding on 33 and 34. That seems to be the mainline strategy. Alternatively, of course, it depending on, let's say, how bad your team looks like in 28, if you're really feeling like you're suffering because you have these Liverpool assets that are going to blank in 28, some people will, of course, look to gamble towards that and play more heavily towards 27, 29, and wildcard on 26 or 27. So wildcard on 26 or 27, I think there's no difference really between when you actually decide to do it. I think you just have to look at, let's say, if you've gone for triple Liverpool assets and you're super tired and you don't want to have these Liverpool assets for the United game, then wildcard on 26. But keep in mind, of course, there will be a break between 26 and 27. So therefore, you'll have less information to play around 27. But the reality is you're probably still going to be invested into triple Brighton. You might have 2 Brentford. You might even have 3, but I don't think it's a great option because, of course, that kind of triples you a little bit with blank game week 28. So I think double Brentford seems to make sense, but of course, there is such a lovely fixture there between Everton and Southampton. Maybe you could consider, let's say, going for something ambitious such as Mbeumo and then transferring immediately towards Watkins. That could be something that could be possible if you've planned your wildcard on 27. Alternatively, you would be thinking about going for Chelsea assets and these Aston Villa assets, because filling your team with these assets is a bit of a no-brainer because you get to capitalize on their 29 fixtures naturally, and you also probably get rid of your Liverpool assets too, even though, of course, you might be missing on the Bournemouth game. You'd be skipping the United game as well, and you'd get rid of the Fulham assets without any issues. So right now, a lot of us probably have 1 to 2 Fulham assets. Those are all going to be going straight to the bin in a wild card on 26/27. And you'd also probably be investing into potentially, let's say, just Haaland within the City team, just Rashford within the Man United team, but you could maybe reinvest a little bit more into this Newcastle team, and that could set you up quite well with 29, even though they do still have to play Man United. You'd only have to really worry about the next Newcastle blank, which is going to be on that Tottenham game. So that's the kind of trajectory that you'd be looking for with a sort of 26/27 wildcard. The alternative, of course, is going for 33. And what's interesting about 27 in the terms of wildcard there is you'd be thinking about bench boosting in 29 as well, because it's such a natural bench boost where you have these Brighton and these Brentford assets who just have back-to-back doubles. You'd also be picking these Chelsea and Aston Villa assets who have great games heading towards 33. Chelsea, of course, might blank in 32, but you have the opportunity to plan around that. And you'd be setting your team up like so. And then you'd also be able to keep all your Arsenal assets that you'd probably keep anyways. You'd probably actually keep two of these Arsenal assets, probably just Saka and Odegaard, depending on, let's say, how Arsenal's defensive results continue to build on. So this could be an interesting opportunity to, let's say, hop off as well on one of your Arsenal assets, invest into teams that actually have these doubles and probably play a very, very strong bench boost, whilst also still keeping the core Arsenal assets that should be under threat from, and also, of course, keeping Haaland that week on your bench. Now, if you wildcard on 33, this opportunity here is going to be something where you need to plan around these early fixtures now. Think about how you plan to play around game weeks 28, how you plan to naturally play around, let's say, 27, 29. And I think the simple strategy is going for, first of all, front loading these Brighton assets, then going for, let's say, an Aston Villa asset on game week 28, and then actually making some natural transfers, such as maybe even a Chelsea asset on 29, or further investing into maybe one more Man United asset on 29, because of course the sort of fixture run between 29 and 31 for United asset is really good. I think I wouldn't really want to miss a window there, so it might be interesting to go into back into Shaw that week, go double United between 29, 30, 31, and then think about offloading once again. You of course have the opportunity here, of course, as well, to go into, let's say, a Newcastle asset, but you need to worry about how your team looks for game week 32. And I think that's one of the issues to think about. Nottingham Forest is a team that doesn't blank on 32, Crystal Palace, but these are two teams that I would really simply just ignore from an FPL point of view. You could think about Johnson, because Johnson actually has a really, really good 29 game week fixture, but it's tough. It really just simply depends on what kind of FPL structure you have. If you have a 3-4-3 formation and you have this sort of Nanto spot, this Greenwood spot, maybe you could think about Johnson in that situation. But the thing that I would say hurts a little bit with 29 and wildcarding 33 is it makes it a lot harder to go for some tempting assets like the Leicester assets that we mentioned about, if you would like to free hit around that area. Because I think the Leicester team unfortunately has some pretty tough games. It's hard to see which week you'd specifically think about transferring the Leicester assets outside of maybe 29, just so you can capture 29-30, which is actually a shorter window than the United window that we were talking about as well, depending on what happens with blank game week 32. So that's the kind of trickiness, I would say, with heading towards 33. But I would say there's probably going to be, delayed gratitude or gratification, really, where 33 or 34, because you wildcard on 33 and because you dead end there, you'd also be able to capture 34 as well extremely well, and you have the back-to-back bench boost, which actually feels a lot better than naturally playing, let's say, 27, planning for a bench boost on 29, because there could be a lot of changes between 27, 28, 29 that could actually hamper whatever bench boost you have planned on 29. 29 is also interesting as a natural bench boost, actually, if you plan on being a wildcard 33 player, because why is that interesting? Wildcard 33 will definitely set your team up all the way towards game week 38. So maybe you'd also say to yourself as well that you'd be set up for 34. You don't really need a bench boost, and maybe a bench boost is supernatural on 29 because you have a Leicester double game week there where there are genuine opportunities for Ward to get a double clean sheet, right? Versus Crystal Palace and Aston Villa. This is potentially a crazy situation, but of course you have one clean sheet. I would say that could be possible and reachable here, and you wouldn't have to waste a transfer there. It's a very natural one. You already have your keeper there, and then you've got three flexible players probably coming out of all the enablers that you have from these Brighton teams, Brighton assets that are so cheap to think about. So this is kind of my thoughts on wildcarding. I think the strategy is probably going to be whether you 26, 27 wildcard based on the impacts of the Liverpool game and that sort of Leeds versus Fulham FA Cup fixture, I think there isn't going to be a true sort of optimality between what's better. I think it really depends on looking at your own team. So what's interesting now is probably to look at each team in isolation. With Arsenal, I think the strategy for the rest of the season is simply just going for nailed assets. We've talked about Saka, Odegaard, Gabriel. Zinchenko, I think, is up there as well because he's taking so many shots per game. He's undeniably going to score just like he did in the previous match. Now, maybe it'll take him 5-6 more games to score, but the reality is Zinchenko, I think, is nailed, and he's a key asset for this Arsenal team. Aston Villa is one of the best teams to invest into, but it's tricky to find assets to invest into from Aston Villa outside of maybe one defender and also Watkins. I think these are the two priority targets to focus on. With Bournemouth, I think the only opportunities here are simply to look at Solanke as a free hit opportunity in 29, maybe also Marcus Tavernier. As far as Brentford, you're looking at Tony and probably Raya. Maybe you could go for someone like me as an enabler, but I think Raya is a preferred option to go for as a keeper. And 29 is actually a very, very tough fixture, but actually probably preferential to someone like Tony, who has shown that he's been able to actually score consistently away from home. Arsenal away, offside being a good example of that, but he also hit the post as well, onside. As far as Brighton, this is a great run for any sort of variation of chip strategy to actually own 2 to 3 Brighton assets at the very minimum. So the reality is 27, 29 are too good. And look, you're counting fixtures. You've got 4 fixtures between 27 and 29. Some teams have actually just 3 fixtures between 27 and 29. So it doesn't matter that they have a blank. They just simply have great fixtures. And we know that this Brighton team have been able to consistently actually produce XG versus a lot of the top teams. But maybe you could actually say that they've been still going back into that sort of run of form where they're unclinical. As far as Chelsea, the issue I think here lies in with Potter. You could be investing into Felix. You could have already invested into Felix, and you probably already own Kepa on most or majority of FPL teams. The issue now comes as to whether you think that this Chelsea team will finally actually start scoring as per their XG, or if there's a managerial change. There could generally be a new manager bounce, and we could see the Chelsea team flying. But I think Kai Havertz is still a problem. I think he's an unclinical finisher. And I think Felix has also, even though he shows a lot of flair as a player, and I think he's the most interesting Chelsea asset in terms of the ceiling, outside of Reece James, of course, on a good week, where I would say there are some withdrawals with me in terms of, let's say, investing more than one Chelsea attacker. I think I would really just go for Felix, and I'd probably call it a day. Probably own one more Chelsea defender and also call it a day. As far as Crystal Palace, this is probably a team to ignore. Simply put, one of the worst doubles in 27, just not so interesting whatsoever. As far as Everton, I think this is a team that's interesting in terms of whether you want to invest into Tarkowski and Game Week 25. This is the only transfer I'd really think about, because Everton assets will cover you in 28, 32. 28 is a tough game, but 32 is preferential in terms of if you're someone who's trying to keep your chip options open and you actually prefer Game Week 33 wildcard, then I think Everton and going for Tarkowski this week is very, very sensible, because Game Week 32 versus Crystal Palace is a nice fixture on paper. Even next week, where you have this Liverpool and United probably bench situation, you could probably bring in Everton, Tarkowski versus Nottingham Forest. I don't think it's a crazy idea. Fulham, this is actually a team that would completely bid off my assets, because this is the last week where Fulham is interesting. So you're going to be playing Andreas this week and probably moving him towards a Matoma / McAllister / a Estupinian, if you, let's say, own a Fulham defender or something like that. So I think this is the week and the last week really to own Fulham, but I think a lot of people are going to go one step ahead of the curve and actually jump out of some of the Fulham assets, mostly Mitrovic owners. People who own Andreas will be going out of Andreas next week. As far as Leeds, I think this is an opportunity here to think about Nonto if you have some sort of team structure which allows for it, but I don't really think it's interesting whatsoever to go into Nonto for now. As far as Leicester, for me, it's really just a free hit angle in 29, trying to look at Iheanacho, Barnes, and Maddison, looking at their form, looking at their minutes, and making sure that you make the right decision 29 if you are free hitting on 29. Otherwise, I think there's not a good enough or consistent enough window for Leicester to be assets that we really think about. As far as Liverpool, they have a double in 29, but it's not great for defense. And I think it's good for Darwin, good for Salah. But do you really want to be keeping these assets all the way towards them? Whereas maybe there are more interesting forwards during this run, specifically Watkins and the Chelsea forwards, or even from the defensive point of view, just going back into a Newcastle asset, going back into a United asset potentially seems to be a little bit more appealing because they have a better double in 29, both of them. So with City, I think this is the window to really just go simply Haaland or go Haaland and Mahrez, hoping that Mahrez gets a lot more minutes in the Premier League, which I think is going to be hard to sort of believe, because you now have the flexibility where Bernardo can play on the right, Foden can play on the left. Foden can also play on the right. And yeah, this is Champions League time. This is Mahrez time. So you are already starting to see Mahrez being rested and rotated. And I think this is why Mahrez doesn't seem appealing as a pick. And with the defenders, we've already explained the situation that there's too much rotation at place. The 32 and the 28 blank for City just makes it really hard to also own these assets. I think some crazy managers will think about going outside of Haaland on game week 28 to maybe Watkins, for example, for like a short-term loan sort of situation. But you're also skipping on Haaland versus Liverpool, which is a very, very good fixture on paper. But he's really the only asset I'd think about. As far as United, this is an interesting team because they have way too many blanks, but a good 29. So for me, they actually appeal as a team to target on the free hit. But I would say United is probably a team I wouldn't think about owning more than one asset for during this run, because it's so hard to envision Shaw getting points outside of 29, 30, 31. That might be the one sort of short-term stopgap where you reinvest into United if you're not a free hitter. As far as Newcastle, this is an interesting one where I think Trippier seems to be a lock on a lot of people's teams, because Shaw is the one who's actually exiting a lot of people's teams. A lot of people also have more value held into Trippier. And I think the fixtures are actually just simply better, right? You just have one more fixture than United, and that's the reality. So I think Newcastle just beat out United just simply due to that additional fixture. And you have to think that Bruno Guimaraes coming back into the team is going to improve the overall quality. Nottingham Forest, as I said, is just a Johnson angle purely. Whether you go for, let's say, a 29 free hit, or you think about Johnson as some sort of enabler for you over this run, because they don't really have any blanks in the short term. As far as Southampton, a team that I really wouldn't invest into, sadly. There might be a James Ward-Prowse angle if you have some sort of chip strategy planned around 27, but I don't think many people do. And simply put, they have very, very tough fixtures as well. And added on top of that is the Ward-Prowse problem. He doesn't really score based on fixture difficulty. He's a free kick taker, so he just needs one chance, one opportunity. But it also means that if you give him 10 chances, 10 opportunities versus weaker teams, that might not necessarily pan out, because he's not someone who necessarily scores traditionally from open play. Free kicks are much more different. Tottenham, this is interesting because they actually have a lot of sort of fixtures in flux where they could have a potential double in game week 29, and that would change our free hit 29 strategy, of course. But a lot of people are seeing this as an opportunity now to move out of Kane because of the blank in 28 as well. And I think this is a good opportunity to do so. If you were to embrace someone like Salah this week, and your only way of doing so is to move out of Kane, I think this is a good opportunity to do it. Otherwise, I think maybe owning Kane and holding him is not a bad idea, because Wolves and Nottingham Forest are fantastic fixtures by themselves. And if you think, let's say, Salah is too much of a hassle, especially since he also has a high chance himself of blanking in 28, then I can understand keeping Kane in terms of your sights. You could also think about Emerson as well, but we need to see what happens with the Pedro Porro situation. As far as West Ham, not a team that I'd really think about. Maybe you could go for Bowen. Their numbers have crept up a little bit in terms of the attacking numbers, and I think Bowen has consistently maintained some good numbers for West Ham, but still a team that I would definitely avoid just because they haven't really shown much quality overall, and I think there's just not enough from an asset that is as expensive as Bowen. When you look at, let's say, across the board to Brighton assets that are so cheap in the midfield, I think there's no contest there. And with Wolves, I think they have the worst double game in 25. If you already went into Kilman, I can understand. If you already own Bueno, I can understand keeping him. But he just doesn't seem, or no Wolves assets really seem to provide any value. I think, of course, people are thinking about Sarabia and Cunha, but I think that there's no interest there. And that's my genuine thoughts on the impacts in terms of double game week 29 and my chip strategies as well. Just kind of look at all the sort of scenarios. I think really there is no true optimal strategy in FPL. You have to look at your team, the way things stand, how impacted you are on blank game weeks. But overall, I think the overall theme that I would impart is that you probably stand to gain a lot more from a free hit in a very strong double game week, which you can't cover, right? Because it's not like you're going to be wildcarding on 29 and bench boosting on 34. The reality is you're probably going to be wildcarding either before 29 or before 34, and then bench boosting right after it. So this is the genuine kind of, I think, strategy that makes sense if you have this sort of wild card and bench boost template. If you're free hitting, of course, just simply, I would say, look towards targeting 29 and 34, but making sure that your team is robust with these teams that don't have blanks. And I think Aston Villa is a perfect example of that this week. So I can understand a lot of people going into Watkins as an example outside of Darwin, who's going to be the priority forward asset this week. But those are my thoughts on FPL. I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and I'll see you guys soon.